Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seventh edition of All Things Aviation. I'm Vince Mickens. As many of you know, this initiative was created on behalf of the Bob Hoover Legacy Foundation and is designed to open the eyes of aspiring young aviators to all aspects of aviation and the industry, in addition to those interested in flying professionally as a pilot for the airlines. Our seasoned aviation professional guests today are David Best. He is a Senior Vice President and General Manager for Jet Aviation U.S. Regions, based out of Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Jet Aviation has 33 FBOs worldwide, fixed base operators. They do maintenance, they do completions, flight services, charters, staffing services, aircraft sales, etc. We also have Sean Lee. Sean is the General Manager of Aviation for the Coca-Cola Company in Atlanta, based out of Fulton County Airport, better known as Brown Field, or for some of us, we call it affectionately Charlie Brown. And for those of us, and joining us for the virtual roundtable discussion to gain insight on the best ways to navigate their career paths, we have three dynamic, aspiring young aviation professionals. First, Mariano Quintero, who recently graduated this year from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. Mariano has his CFI, Certified Flight Instructor, which means he can teach others to fly. I always think that's interesting. You get your CFI after you've had some training and you can start teaching others. Pretty cool. He's also working on his master's in aviation finance, and we'll find out more about that and why he decided to go for an advanced degree while he's still working towards his professional pilot opportunities. We have Daniel Buchanan. Daniel is a senior at Embry-Riddle, also at Daytona Beach. Daniel's been thinking about an aviation career since the tender age of 4. Kind of think that's probably because his dad used to take him to watch aircraft land and take off at JFK in New York. So we'll hear more about his growth in the aviation arena and where he is now. And third, we have Caitlin Fueling. Caitlin, I didn't say anything about this during our pre-show, but Fueling is an interesting last name. I'm sure you've heard comments about it, especially with you having the background of having your father and grandfather in the both flying in the Air Force. So that's pretty kind of appropriate, so to say.
Yeah.
As I said, I'm sure you've heard that. So you really you remind me a lot. I have 3 daughters, and one of them in particular, actually all of them did it, but one in particular while she was in high school was kind of contemplating what she wanted to do or not do and things like that, and wasn't really sure and was trying to figure it all out. And what reminds me about that is that she decided, she made one firm decision. She said she did not want to be stuck in a 9-to-5 job in an office somewhere. So when I saw that in your background, I thought, yep, makes a lot of sense. I hear that a lot from people your age. And then it was interesting because for you to have a father and grandfather flying in the Air Force, that it took your dad to take you up on an introductory flight, so to speak, that really sparked your interest in aviation. Did I have that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So with that, I thought it would be really appropriate to let you start things off with a conversation with Sean Lee, since Sean heads the flight department for the Coca-Cola Company and is a graduate of the Air Force Academy and has a lot of background in both military flying, corporate flying, etc. that we could start that out with. So how about you tell us a little bit more about how you got into flying and your background, where you're from and that type of thing, and then present your first question to Sean.
Sounds good. So I'm originally from Rapid City, South Dakota. And like Vince said, I didn't start flying until I was a senior in high school because I didn't actually know what I wanted to do. My dad took me on my first flight with one of his friends who had a small airplane. I'd never been in a small airplane before. And it was actually like just really awesome. And I knew that was something I had to do. And after going through 3 years of school here and getting my commercial rating and my instrument rating as well, I decided that I think I want to pursue a career in the Air Force, which is really good that Sean is in this webinar, because although my dad was in the Air Force, he wasn't a pilot, and obviously that is what I want to do. So it'll be really good insight to get from Sean. My first question would be for someone who wants to be a pilot but doesn't know what they want to fly concerning heavies or fighters. What steps would you take to choose? If you could have any choice of any aircraft you want, what would you do?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. So, and I will tell you, being in the Air Force and whatever you get to fly, you're going to love whatever plane you're allowed to fly. But I will say, right now, you're in such a unique position um, because you're able to come into the Air Force and you're already an aviator. You're already going to be a CFI. The people that you're going to be in competition with for aircraft are going to be half of them, three-quarters of them will be fairly brand new to jet aircraft and probably barely understand what a pattern is. So you're going to be so far ahead of them. It's a great opportunity for somebody like yourself to be coming out of Emory and over into the Air Force. So kudos on that first and foremost. But the bigger question, what to fly? Do we want to go fighters or do we want to go heavies? Do you want to refuel aircraft? And there's such a plethora of jobs. Part of the adventure is just learning about it along the way, going into Air Force pilot training. You'll have instructors who've been on both sides of the world, so you'll get their insights. The big thing for me was I always thought, and like most people, I wanted to be a pilot when I was 5 years old. So I've been pursuing that dream through Civil Air Patrol, Junior ROTC, and then the Air Force Academy, pursuing that dream my entire life. And when I finally got there, it was always, I want to fly the fastest, brightest new fighter jet that's out there. And one of my instructors said, "Are you sure you're going to make a career of the Air Force?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I hadn't thought that far." And he says, "Well, if there's any chance that you think you're going to get out in 10 years, the fighter will be fun for an hour at a time. That KC-10 with the DC-10 type rating will be a lot funner for a lifetime." And that was probably some of the best advice that I ever got, because I wasn't sure that I was going to make a career of it. And being young 20s, you don't know what you're going to do in your next phase of life. And I decided to take the DC-10 type rating and do refueling and travel around the world. And I remember my first trip as a young 22-year-old was an around the world trip. It was my very first trip before I even did something local. It probably the greatest experience that I had. And when you go from experiences like that, you learn very quickly that the one thing that is the big things that are transferable out of the military are type ratings. So hours and type ratings in a DC-10, or when I went on further, BBJs, Gulfstreams, those were all transferable to the outside. So I always had a career choice of, if I want to stay in the Air Force, I can keep staying in and flying Air Force aircraft. If I want to get out, I had very transferable records that I could easily go to the outside and do something else. And I think it kind of depends on, do you want to keep that flexibility, or do you really want to just have that rush at an hour at a time? And it is a rush. And I think, only you can decide for yourself. But once again, great opportunities awaiting you.
Definitely. My dad likes to not push, but bring up the crew concept a lot. Like, it's nice to not be by yourself. Like, it's nice to have a crew and interact with the crew. And so
I will tell you, that's one of the, if you look at some of the things that served me well in the rest of my career in business aviation: airmanship, leadership, and then camaraderie. And the people I flew with when I was 20 are still people I talk to today. Having those close group of people that you learn your airmanship and you learn your leadership through, they'll stick with you for the rest of your life. So he's right in that respect.
definitely.
One of the things that you brought up was you called it ROTC, which is the nickname for it, or acronym, but the ROTC program, or I think you said junior ROTC. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because I think it's helpful for people to know that that's a really great program to transition into the military.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I guess, and we'll start with the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC. So available to high schoolers, usually at the magnet high schools around the country, is Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps. It is a formal course that teaches you the basics of military profession. They have junior ROTC for Air Force, Army, Navy. So depending on whatever field you want to narrow down to, but it really teaches you the basics, how to wear a uniform, how to polish shoes, how to know what military customs and courtesies are, what those customs and courtesies are, but they serve as a feeder to get you ready for college. So that when you are starting to apply for colleges, you already have a baseline that will line you up for scholarships. And coming from where I came from at the time was in San Jose, California. We weren't the wealthiest family out there. So for me, being able to get in a plane or actually rent a plane was never something I could do. But going to the junior ROTC programs at my high school then allowed me the access to go on field trips to military bases, to Beale Air Force Base, Travis Air Force Base, and have exposure to military aircraft and other pilots for me to continue my furthering education and actually go through stuff like ground school at a reduced cost. So definitely a great feeder program from the high school level. And then when you start looking at colleges, you have what is formal Reserve Officer Training Corps, which you are then a commissioned officer in the Air Force. I'll equate it to being at the Air Force Academy, except you're at whatever college you choose to attend. And once again, it lines you up for a path in whichever service that you're destined to be a part of.
That's great. Thank you that's a great explanation of it. I did the junior ROTC program and thought it was great. I just did a little different path because you can't do flight training in the Navy with glasses. That's the only drawback for me on that. Anyhow, let's talk with Mariano Quintero for a minute. Mariano, you have an interesting path too. So, and you got some exposure that kind of changed your track a little bit in the sense that you were on track for the usual, like go to school, do my aeronautical science training, flight training, look forward to flying for a regional and eventually for a major airline and that type of thing. And then something happened. You got a scholarship from the Citation Jet Pilots Association along with the Bob Hoover Legacy Foundation. And you got a peek into the world of business aviation, which is actually both Sean and David's world. And in looking at that, it opened your eyes to other opportunities beyond just being a commercial pilot. Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I was a Bob Hoover Scholar back in 2018, and one of the nicest or greatest opportunities that was afforded to me was being able to interact with the industry, meet leaders in aviation, and sort of open my world to what's beyond sort of just simple airline flying, right? So since that time, I've really been interested in pursuing something further along the lines of sort of getting to know the business side of aviation.
Yeah. So, and David, with Jet Aviation, you guys cover a lot of territory in that area in terms of private flying, business flying, corporate flying, as many call it, and all the other services that you guys do related to that. Can you tell us a little bit about you and about Jet Aviation and what you do for them?
Certainly. Thanks, Vince. And also, before I start, a big shout out to the Bob Hoover Legacy Foundation for the opportunity it gives these aspiring aviators for the future and the people that are going to fund their industry with talent going forward. So I think that's a great thing that the foundation does. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Jet Aviation, it's a long-standing business in the industry. It's been we're 53 years in business. Started out in Switzerland. It actually started out with 3 military guys that bought some Learjets and wanted them converted into what effectively was the first business aviation fleet way back in the 1960s. And from then it grew and expanded through several ownerships. We're now part of General Dynamics, which is the company that owns Gulfstream. You'll know them from that, which is obviously one of the world's leading business jet manufacturers. And Jet Aviation itself, I run the US part of the business. So in that, I get four sort of profit streams, and I suppose for the audience, I'm slightly different than Sean in two ways. One is that I'm not a pilot, so I'm from the business side of the aviation community, and I've done quite a few jobs through that in a breadth of career. But also, I tumbled into it by accident, Sean. I didn't have any lying in my bed as a 4-year-old dreaming of flying aircraft. So I'm afraid I fell into it. And having fallen in the door over 20 years ago, there's nowhere else I'd rather work. It's business aviation and commercial aviation is a fabulous place to have your career. So I could not recommend it highly enough. So back to Jet Aviation, we've got about 4,000 people around the world. We've got 300 large cabin aircraft under management, of which 170 sit over here in the US. We've got about 1.7 million man hours of maintenance. Big bases are in Switzerland and in Singapore. We've got a small base in California. We then have a big charter business. We do about 15, 20,000 hours of charter a year and 33 fixed base operations, which are obviously the terminals that the corporate jets land at. So it's I came up through that kind of FBO side, and I've been really lucky to have worked all around the world. I spent time living and working in London. I then moved to the US and then moved to Asia, where I set up Asia Pacific for an aviation company, and then moved back to the US about 5-6 years ago. And I joined Jet about 4 years ago. And I think, Mariano, for you, I see that you're doing aviation finance as part of your business degree. And I kind of would say that to everybody, that there's a real basic bit about understanding the numbers. Whatever job you go into, as you become more senior, you end up managing people, you end up managing departments. And if you've got an aspiration to have a career, a good place to start is always understanding the numbers. Because
absolutely.
These businesses are ventures. They're passions for people, and aviation's full of passionate people, but they've also got stakeholders and people that actually want to know why you're flying something, at what cost, and with what return. So
Mariano, why did you pick to do a master's, not just a master's in business, but a master's in aviation finance? Why did you choose that?
Well, I've always had a little bit of a passion for numbers and things like that. Obviously flying is a big portion of what I do here at Embry-Riddle, but a nice thing that's afforded to me as a flight instructor for the school is being able to have tuition benefits and continue my education. So I figured now is the best opportunity that I have, at my young age, to sort of continue, learn more and get more of an industry insight before I, head out and start my career. So I figured now is the best opportunity. Let's give it a shot and see where it takes me. And I'm absolutely thankful that I took that opportunity.
Great. We're going to come back a little bit more to talk more about jet aviation, but I actually have a question from one of our viewers. It's Debbie Lau out of Phoenix, Arizona. And Debbie is asking, she said, aside from the RLTC and military, what are the options available to newer pilots regarding the minimum flight hours of 1,500? And what do you recommend about that in terms of gaining the hours? We know about flight training, et cetera, and so forth, but I think she'd like to hear from both Sean in particular and David about addressing that.
No, that's a great question. And thank you for presenting it. Yes, we do have a challenge with getting people from A to Z, as it were. We, as a corporate flight department here in the Atlanta area, have pitched in with other companies to address that fully. I think the bigger question she's asking is, hey, what services are available out there? And quite honestly, there's not a lot of formal services. You do have smaller flight companies who will take you on to get you up to the ATP requirements. This was a burning question about 6 months ago. The pandemic has obviously changed staffing requirements, but 6 months ago, I can tell you from the business aviation standpoint, the Part 91 standpoint, there were not enough qualified pilots to go around. And we were all discussing how do we grow younger pilots. And we had actually pitched in at Fulton County as a collective. So you're talking the Home Depots, Arthur Blanks, Norfolk Southerns of the world. It all pitched in to say, okay, if we can sponsor a pilot at 750 hours, what does that look like to put them with a charter company? And we'll sponsor their training, but to get them from 750 to 1,500 hours to start growing a pipeline worth of talent. Right now, I think it's what a lot of, when you're looking at the talented individuals that we have on this call today, right? They're all at the school building time so that they can get up to the ATP minimums. And I think that's one of the biggest draws for schools like Emory-Riddle or Purdue, the aviation-centric universities that are out there. Is as a student, you can continue to fly until you meet those minimums.
So that brings up a couple of good points. One is it has to do with, I think it's really important for young people in particular to realize that you may have to do other things in the industry, but it still keeps you in the industry while you're building your time as a flight instructor or other ways to do that. I think a lot of times, sometimes I should say, that some students feel like, well, this is not looking really great. Maybe I need to think of another career altogether. And one of the things that we want to show is, no, you can stay in the industry. For example, with Jet Aviation has the staffing services that provide professional staffing for all aspects, basically, of the industry. And there's other opportunities of that nature. So I think it's just important that we remember that that does exist and people can do that. I think the other part that we'll probably one of you guys could expand on, and that is if you're in, so two of our guests today are seniors. One of them has already determined she's going the military route. The other guest, Daniel, and pull up Daniel's information so I get it correctly. So Daniel's the one who started loving flying when he was 4, and his dad used to take him to the airport at JFK. And he's currently going through the aeronautical science program at Embry-Riddle at Daytona Beach. In his senior year, he made it mentioned that he's a third-year senior, which is pretty impressive. That means he's ahead of the game and that type of thing. Daniel, can you tell us a little bit more about your growth and interest in flying? And the part that I thought was interesting in your background was you talked about things like the pilot's role as a role model in terms of having exceptional interpersonal skills, demonstrating outstanding leadership qualities, time management skills. I've really seldom heard a young aviation professional or aspiring young aviation professional talk about those aspects of the industry. And by the way, those fit, nothing against the airlines, but those fit very nicely with business aviation.
I know. Yeah, that's true. But like just from just the values that my parents have just instilled in me over time, I just, as I said, from 4 years old, clearly at 4, you're not really thinking about all those things, but just growing up and seeing how pilots carry themselves and just how they interact with each other and really what makes the whole dynamic work. We were talking about crews earlier, what makes a crew work. I have a class here. Caitlin also has it at Prescott as well, called crew resource management, where you actually see
CRM.
CRM. You see how a crew is supposed to act and what how one thing can just throw off a situation. So all those little skills, interpersonal, dealing with flight attendants, passengers, how that can all make it can make or break a situation. So I feel like as a pilot, as a professional overall, but as a pilot specifically, you just need to have those skills on point, because that can be the matter of life or death. So I think that's a major foundation that we have to have.
David and Sean, I'll give that one to you.
Yeah, well, I'll take that. I'll talk a little bit about pilots and crew. Just finishing up on the last point about where you can build hours. We had part of our company, so a lot of our line staff at the FBOs, the guys that move the aircraft about or dispatch, are all qualifying to be pilots. So they like being around the airport. they like being involved in the industry, and they spend their time at the front line and fly in their spare time. So it's fairly typical to have aspiring pilots as part of your crew. We've got about 600 pilots on the books, and going back to Daniel's point about being a role model, you would be amazed how many companies, when we put supplemental crew on an aircraft, ask for specific people. I'd say 90% of people say, hey, we flew with Daniel last week. He was great. He was polite. He was good. I'd love to see him back again. So how you act in the cockpit,
they remember
and how
you.
set a role, yeah,
Exactly.
it's absolutely critical to how you do that. The other thing I was going to say, Vince, was from a building hours perspective. We had a young aspiring pilot leave us recently to go and tow gliders, and effectively he gets an incredibly high amount of landings. He gets an incredibly high amount of hours because he can just churn all day, land, tow, take off, land, tow, take off. He goes, just keeps going. And
Wow.
that was how he was building his hours to get into regional airlines, and then regional airlines into the big airlines.
Yeah, I've heard the same thing with people that do the banner towing. There's a guy that has like 2,500 hours of banner towing, and he felt like he wasn't qualified to go to the airlines or any other aspect of flying professionally because he was a banner tow pilot. And I was like, no, that takes some skill to fly just above stall speed, towing a banner at low altitude.
Yep. And I think the other thing not to miss out on, people are, I said I fell into this career, and I've had some wonderful jobs in aviation, from running acquisitions to running businesses to managing a whole commercial team of sales guys that talk to high net worth individuals on a day in, day out basis. We're talking to the billionaires and the big corporate Fortune 100s and at principal level on a daily basis, and these jobs all exist in the industry. So one thing I would say to all, especially the aspiring pilots, is don't be scared of staying in the aircraft you're in for a while to build your experience. We tend to find we get some, and I see Sean nodding, we have in the fleet, we've got all sorts of aircraft, and recently we sold a Hawker 800, and we sold the Hawker 800 because we couldn't keep pilots, because every pilot that managed to sort of grasp their way into the cockpit and get twin jet time, as soon as they could, they wanted to jump into a Gulfstream or they wanted to jump into a Global. They didn't want to stay and build the hours in the not as sexy jet. But there's really good careers to be had in building good hours and good experience in some of the either older platforms or some of the smaller companies. And if you're in a smaller company, your opportunity to get to assistant chief pilot, run a flight department is much quicker than it is in a big flight department. There isn't many Seans.
Sean, you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, and I think all of our panelists have kind of hit on it, right? So being an aviator is much more than just being a pilot. There's pieces of airmanship, which we all need, but there's leadership, there's financial stewardship. All of these things need to come together to be a successful aviator, and much bigger than that, just successful in life in general, right? We all need to know how to manage finances. We all need to know how to be flexible. We need to know how to have the emotional intelligence piece to interact with other people around us. But, as David was just pointing out, the plethora of jobs that are available out there, I know it seems like it's not many, but it's really huge. I mean, there's everything that you look at in an aircraft has to be made by a company. So I don't care if it's Raytheon or L3 or Honeywell. Well, guess what? All of these airplane component companies also have airplanes. They also have follow-on divisions. These are all companies that understand aviation. And if you're working at these companies, I don't care if you're working in the mailroom and you say, hey, I'm going to fly in my spare time to build time. All of these companies at a base level are supportive of that, because they know this is feeding back into the industry. So when you start saying, hey, well, what jobs can I do? It's really unlimited, the amount of jobs that are out there, and they don't have to be directly in an airport. They don't you could be at an office building working at L3, and yet you're probably going to be exposed to aviation projects across the spectrum. And if you ever tell your boss, hey, I need to go out and fly to build time, I can almost guarantee you're not going to get pushback on that. So
you might even get help.
Almost unilaterally you will. And people don't think of these non-traditional channels, but they are. And then, talking about the smaller departments and the smaller aviation channels, I am all for that. And the reason is because you do get more experiences when you're with smaller operations. You get to see safety, you get to see standards, you get to see training, as well as budgeting, and have the one-on-one interaction with executives, building experiences that maybe peers and not to pick on airlines, but that you're not going to get at United or Delta, right? So there's lots of growth to be had out there and lots of opportunity. And I will tell everybody who's listening on this line, the opportunity on the business side is only growing. If you look at the latest numbers, I think it was May was the first time in history that there was more business aviation flights in the U.S. System than there were commercial flights. And that's really not slowing down right now.
That brings up a really good point too. And absolutely, the thing I think that these young professionals need to hear is that aviation is thriving and doing well. Yes, it's taken a hit from the pandemic, but to your point, Sean, business aviation in particular has seen growth and continuing to see growth. Everybody I've talked to, from manufacturers to heads of flight departments like yourself, to heads of FBOs like Jet Aviation like David, all are saying that they're seeing an uptick in activity. And that uptick affects all aspects. Again, talking about the different aspects of the industry. For example, you mentioned L3 and Honeywell. We had Garmin on a couple of weeks ago, and Garmin talked about the fact that they have a fleet of aircraft that they use for testing their avionics, that they use for flying their staff, for demo flights, et cetera, and so forth. So again, those are other places that you could work somewhere and eventually work your way into an opportunity that you may not have conceived before. So the head of sales for Garmin wanted to be an airline pilot. He got all of his ratings to fly all the way up to the ATP, et cetera, and so forth. Things happened. He ended up working at Garmin. Now he's the head of their aviation sales, and he gets to fly all the time, just in a different way than he had anticipated. So those opportunities are there.
Yeah. And kudos to Mariano for going with his MBA in finance. That's a great move right now. I have on a shirt that says Global Jet Capital. They're one of the larger financing corporations out there. And guess what? About half the people over there are pilots who used to fly, but now deal strictly in aviation finance, which is if you can imagine, your average Gulfstream is around $50 million. And the amount, if you're selling 100 of those a year, somebody's financing those aircraft or leasing those aircraft. So great business to be in.
Daniel, do you have a question for Sean or David?
I actually do. I have a question for both Sean and David. So it's we were talking about corporate aviation. So you guys kind of piqued my interest now. What would you guys be looking for, a potential new hire? What would you want them to have, especially in, a post-COVID environment where it's a lot more competitive, because we all know that the airlines took a huge hit and people are looking for other channels to go to. So what would you guys want?
So let me start with let me start with the kind of the practical. So I mean, what's happened post COVID is there's a lot of resources being thrown into the system. So we typically hire we typically hire about 10 to 15 pilots a month for our fleet. As we bring on aircraft and things move. post-COVID, and no one in this call should take this as a permanent situation. This is a post-COVID world as the world settles out. We're getting 1,500 applications per pilot position at the moment. And of course, what that does is it changes the balance of what experience people want whenever they're putting a fleet. And of course, you're not going to, as a new hire, you're not going to jump into, one of the seats in a G600 or something. So, you get the corporates are looking for experienced global pilots. What we are looking for, however, is they always say you should never waste a great emergency or a great crisis. And I think a lot of the companies aren't wasting a great crisis. And the real thing that they're taking the chance with changing is making sure that the people they surround themselves have got the right attitude and the right, you can train the skills, but you just buy the attitude and train the skills. So what you said earlier on about being a role model, and what you said earlier on about, setting an example, and being enthusiastic, being bright, that's your advantage when you go and look for a job. Once getting in the door is different than moving around once you're inside. Getting in the door is the important part, and getting your foot across there, and you get that by your attitude.
Sean, what do you look for?
Well, that's a great question, and David just alluded to it, right? We have a lot more talent in the pool right now, and as a corporate flight department, what you will find with corporates generally is it really depends on their mission. Do you have a domestic mission? Do you have an international mission? The Coca-Cola company is obviously a global brand. We spend 75% of our flight time internationally. So there is a different skill set that we're looking for when it comes to the majority of our hires. But what I will say is, if we're looking at the big picture world, right, not this immediate post-COVID world, the truth is you can't have all of one thing. So as nice as it is to have all 10,000 hour international captains, that doesn't do well for me from an overall standpoint of running a department. We've recently started looking at, diversity of thought, age, experience, to a point where, because we are so heavily vested in flying internationally, we look at, hey, how many languages do you speak? Have you ever lived abroad? And our criteria is heavily on the emotional intelligence side, because as David was just saying, right, the skills I can teach, takeoff, landing, even international customs, all that stuff is teachable. But having the emotional intelligence, being able to interact with your peers, with your customers, that's just not a very teachable skill. And at the age that we're seeing people, either you have it or you don't. And if we're going to invest in you, that's a skill that you have to have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you bring up about that both of you bring up, actually. One of the things that I think these young people and people watching are probably most concerned about. So you're a senior or you just graduated, you don't have a lot of hours, and you're trying to get the wheels turning and get things started. The example I'll use, and Daniel, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but with somebody like Daniel who's working in the dispatch department, dispatching aircraft, et cetera, and all of the things that go with that, would it behoove him to look for a position at a small flight department as an assistant scheduler and dispatcher, or scheduler and dispatcher, to work in, as an example, in business aviation while he's building his time and working towards becoming a professional pilot?
I think small or large. We obviously employ dispatchers all the time. We dispatch about 100 legs a day out of the US. So we got a bunch of people doing that, and there's a natural attrition in the world where you're always looking for people. So any experience that you can bring in, and as Sean correctly said, that whole diversity of experience is key as well. The advantages you probably get in a much smaller place is you can go in with an understanding that as flying becomes available, you'll get an opportunity. The trouble with a big company obviously is that you're your opportunities come through progression within the company, as opposed to, being all things to all men. So it's about specialism versus the opportunity to try many things.
That being said, that even an entry-level position in a company your size, Jet Aviation, could still get you, once you're inside. I guess this is more of my perspective. Once you're inside, then you can see what the availabilities are, and you can move about better in terms of capitalizing on those opportunities, much more so than from the outside.
Absolutely. So the gentleman who runs all of my aircraft management started off as an engineer. He can fly, but he was turning spanners. And today, as his career progressed, he became, bigger job, and then ultimately a DOM, and then he moved across, and he was the number 2 to the guy who ran the whole thing. And last year he stepped up into that. So there's the path isn't straight.
Exactly.
You're not going to go from it. You're going to wander off in some good times.
Sure. Sean, what would you recommend to Caitlin? She knows she wants to go to military track. She still has another year left in school. What can she do between now and then to prepare herself to even be more effective going that route?
Well, and I think, so she made the most important decision of, yes, this is something I want to do or I'm willing to do. That's usually the hardest part. I think the next biggest decision for her is, am I going to go full-time active duty military, or am I going to look for a guard and reserve unit? And, I had never heard about a guard and reserve unit until I actually got to pilot training, which is horrible. It just never crossed my mind. But and so, Caitlin, if nobody's told you this before, if you start looking at where you want to live at in the world, and you say, hey, I want to live in Atlanta, Georgia, and you say, well, there's a guard unit up there that already flies C-130s. If I am hired by that guard unit, not only is it it's a part-time, full-time job, but you're guaranteed the aircraft that you're going to fly because you've already been hired into that position. So I would think for somebody like Caitlin is, first things first, if you already know what you want to fly and you know where you want to live, and those two things can marry up somewhere, that's a great opportunity, because being a guard or a reservist, you can do your military flying, but then at a certain point, you can still be part-time in the military, but also do civilian flying. So in 3 years, if the airlines are opening back up and you're seeing a pipeline there, you don't have to wait till year 8 to jump out of the military and get back into commercial flying. So, there's a lot of flexibility there,
really
but once again, you have to marry up, where do you want to live, and is there a guard unit that flies what you want to fly there? Now, on top of that, what do you need to do to get ready? She's already doing it. Embry is training some of the finest aviators that we're seeing in the industry. So I have no doubt that through flight school and your regular education, that you'll be ready for military pilot training. It's getting ahead on kind of the military stuff, which I'm sure your family's already talked to you about. And then, as Mariano has already done, if there is a chance at starting your continued education, start that. The more boxes that you have filled will once again lead you to more opportunities down the road. David was just saying, the path zigzags. And I would say that for pretty much anybody I've ever known in aviation, there hasn't been one linear path through aviation. It's a little bit here, and then this opportunity came available and we zigged that way, and this opportunity came available and we went that way. So being open to change, flexibility, but just having fun along the way, it's such a fulfilling path. You're already there with everything that you need to be doing.
So Sean, let me give it a not as conventional alternative, which is, if you've got 1 year before you go off to the military, go abroad. Go and be a jackaroo herding sheep with aircraft in Australia, or go fly seaplanes in Maldives, where they're delivering customers into the villas all day long. And you said you went around the world for one of your first ever experiences. I've lived in 3 continents. I've built businesses in all these different places, and there's nothing like the experience of getting taken out of your comfort zone and plopped abroad.
David, oh yeah, that's a great point. I will tell everybody, I spent a year in my military career. I was a air attaché to the Russian embassy in St. Petersburg, Russia. So I spent a year flying King Airs in St. Petersburg, Russia, and Moscow. And once again, as you said, learning to operate in a foreign country, speaking a foreign language 24/7, taking yourself out of your comfort environment and really testing once again your IQ and your EQ at the same time was definitely fundamental in my growth on my path. So no, you're absolutely correct there, David. That's great advice.
It really is. That's great advice from both of you guys. Mariano, coming back to you, did you have another question regarding your career path?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting out back when I was in high school, I originally considered, going abroad and starting a flying career. Now I'm still kind of on the fence whether I want to stay in the US or maybe move abroad eventually. But as probably some viewers are wondering, how would you say, and this is a question for both David and Sean, how would you say you've seen the growth for both business aviation and just like charter services across the world? Is it the same demand that you typically face in the US, or has that growth been exponential outside of what we see here?
So there's an interesting split there between scale and growth. So there's 17 to 19,000 business jets in the world, of which 12 to 13,000 are in the US. The whole of Asia, everyone talks about explosive growth in Asia. There is absolutely explosive growth in Asia, but there's only 1,000 jets. And there's only realistically 4 or 5 main conurbations that people land at. You'll go to Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney. After that, it starts getting pretty thin. Mm-hmm. And there's only 56 large cabin aircraft in the whole of Australia. So even if that grows by 300%, there's only going 150 aircraft. Now we manage over 200 a day in Teterboro. So there's a scale and growth thing. So Europe's the second most mature market, and there's about 3,000 jets in Europe. So the growth has definitely been there. The reason why it's a good experience, and again, Sean's much more of an expert than me, but the US is fairly unique. It is, you can jump in a plane in New York and you can land in LA, and all you have to do is talk to towers all the way across. You start getting into controlled airspace of Eurocontrol. You start getting into flight planning across Asia. Your T+90s in the middle of nowhere where you're trying to hit the
new ball game
islands, hoping for the best. Then it's a whole different experience that adds to your knowledge and your abilities. And then you come back. I work here because it's I'm now a proud US citizen. That was last year. I've been here 11 years. But the scale of the US industry is so much bigger. But the knowledge and complexity of working abroad in a growing industry is really, really good experience for you.
So yeah, I could, I guess, tag on with that. Whether you're going to end up in business aviation, military, or commercial, obviously at a point, if you grow your career, you'll probably end up flying internationally. I mean, that's 80% of most pilots go for 20 years are going to be up on international routes, right? So learning to fly internationally, the younger you do it, the easier it is, like with most things. The younger you start doing something, the easier it is down the road. What I will tell you is there are challenges to international flying that nobody ever talks about. If you fly in South America, flying past the equator, across the Amazon, weird things happen. Nobody ever tells you about hot towers or magnetic variations that are just unbelievable, and you see everything. Flying across up and across the North Pole, doing your polar routes, the different oceanic routes. Now, technology has made a lot of those things easier. Stuff still happens every day, and the earlier you see that, the earlier you understand that and kind of feel it, the better pilot, aviator you're going to be. So as David just said, once again, it comes down to the personal part, learning to have the emotional intelligence, talking with other people, living abroad, just as a personal broadening experience is so incredibly freeing for anybody. I would recommend it. But then when you get into the nuts and bolts of aviation, whether it's flying in South America or flying in Europe, which is highly regulated, anybody can fly in the US. Flying across Europe and 30 countries in 20 minutes, it's a challenge in and of itself. So the more of that you can do, the more I would say, yeah, please do it.
Yeah. Hey, and Sean, another thing, I don't know if it's, and this is my opinion, I don't know if you share it. Learn to fly. That these if you get into G600 these days, they're big flying computers. Go and be a ferry pilot or something. Go learn to get the map out and work out how you're going to land in Keflavik, followed by Wick, and the way down to drop off in Glasgow, Scotland. Go make sure you can fly before you can do the task before you tick the box.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like the G600 is a big iPad at this point, and it's definitely made for a guy like me who's been flying for 30 years. Yes, I can get up, push a button, and sit back. Whereas, if you're flying blue spruce routes, like you said, up to Keflavik and clock to map to ground still, it teaches you aviation, but even more so, it teaches you to respect aircraft. It teaches you to trust in your own ability, and to understand that, nothing is ever going to happen as you planned it. And that's okay, because you've thought about the mitigation for every circumstance and you know how to react properly. And all pilots need to get to that point. So, I 100% agree.
Wonderful. As we start to wrap up, there goes my bandwidth. Speaking of being by the equator, I was having network bandwidth issues, which I can do nothing about, but hope it clears itself. But speaking of that, we are almost running out of time for the program, and I wanted to give each of our young guests an opportunity to ask one final question. So I will start with you, Daniel. Did you have any other questions for our professional guests?
I did. I wanted to know how your companies were handling COVID, because that's like the most interesting topic, I guess, right now, or most pressing topic right now. How have you guys, changed your whole operations in order to deal with what's going on?
Do you want me to start, Sean?
Please.
So between the 18th of March and the 20th of March, we lost 75% of our business overnight. We were chunting along at a nice happy rate, and the world came to a complete stop. We normally dispatch up to 100 aircraft a day from our own fleet. Stopped. Nobody flew. We normally have, Teterboro, for example, the busiest FBO in the world. It handles 140,000 movements a year. Stopped completely. The charter fleet at the time completely stopped. No market whatsoever for supplemental crew. A massive influx of MRO. Everyone that had aircraft pushed them into maintenance because they weren't flying. So they wanted to get them fixed while they weren't there. So the maintenance business was bursting at the seam, and everything else was dead. So you have to take practical business decisions at that point. So at the time, we obviously cut back on all of our extraordinary expenses. We reduced the workforce on a furlough basis because effectively there was nothing for these people to do. And then we in-housed as much as possible. What we've since done then is we then understood we then take a bet on the growth of the business coming back. And we heard a wonderful saying from our boss, our big boss of our General Dynamics. She had an expression that said, "We came down the elevator and we'll have to go back up the stairs." So effectively, we right-sized the business, and now we're stepping back up and bringing people back on, and driving up the business. And it really made us take a long, hard look at all the expenses that crept in over the years and all the things that crept in that you didn't really need to do. Never waste a good crisis. And for all of you, as you go through your career, the one piece of advice I will give you is act early, act decisively, and make hard decisions. And if you do it properly and you do it ahead of time, you get much longer benefit from the decisions you've made, people respect you for it, even though there's difficult decisions, and you come out of it a better business than you went into it.
Thank you, Sean.
So, first off, from a business aircraft perspective, let me start at the kind of strategic level. We're here to support the Coca-Cola company, so we're not here to produce revenue. So from a global standpoint, 50% of Coke sales are through external venues such as concerts, movies, sporting events. Well, on March 19th, that all went away for us. So we lost 50% of our revenue overnight, and to this date, that has not recovered. Now, true enough, from a business standpoint, more people pantry load at home and buy stuff from Costco. So there is some offset to that, but pretty big blow to the overall business. What I think most people don't know about the Coca-Cola company is we are committed to a quote unquote world without waste by 2025. We have major projects in wind farms, biogas, and cleaning up rivers and waterways. That piece of our business has exploded because what do you need in a pandemic? People need clean water to wash their hands. So we have gone on in overdrive to kind of shift our priorities and double down on our environmental bets to refresh the world, put about services that help the environment and really provide a long-term solution to a lot of the environmental problems facing the world. So what does that mean to a department who is trying to fit into the new world of where Coke is going? We had to reevaluate our priorities, right? Make hard decisions. Are we just going to be for executive travel, or are we going to look at a much broader solution? The goal was, hey, so in this new world, what adds value? I'll give a quick example. We had a new facility in Costa Rica, warehousing facility that's 100% completely automated by robots. It was finished being built in June of 2020. And to start the robots, they needed engineers who happened to reside in Italy. So this is back in June when there was no commercial travel. And both countries said, no, we don't want people from Italy, and vice versa. We don't want people crossing our borders. We as a department are out there looking for business and, tuning into all of our channels. And the research and development vice president said, yeah, how do we make this happen? Because we're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars per day, every day that we can't open this plant up. And quick set of phone calls to government officials in both countries. What if we had an aircraft that could fly between these 2 points, not make any stops, and be able to guarantee that the people here were quarantined on one side and quarantined on the other? Then would you be acceptable? Both governments said, yeah, but we know the commercial airlines don't do that. And we said, don't worry about it. We have our own aircraft. We'll make it happen. That was a, indication of a value-added trip to the company to save what in turn could be millions of dollars of months of delay to get a project started back up. So now the kind of what we looked at as being the norm of executive travel has trickled down to the next level to say, what are value-added projects around the world? And let's take those on to increase our value back, our return back to the company. So that's how we've changed.
Thanks.
All right. Caitlin, did you have any final question?
Yeah, I had a question kind of because I'm not really involved in the business side at all. I've never seen anything about that because obviously as a pilot, we get in, we fly, or we decide to fly, and then we land. So Sean, you've been on both sides, but how much coordination actually goes into behind the scenes? As pilots, we just show up and we fly. Is it a lot of coordination between different parts of the company to actually put out each of those flights every day?
It's a ton. And I think that's what you see more on between David and my side. If you come to the Part 91 side, the pilots are a lot more integrated into the operation. The pilots talk to the passengers, right? So we have to have an understanding of kind of what the overall goal is for the flight. We're going into airports that may not be serviced by commercial operators. So there is a lot more coordination between the offices that are requesting the flights and how do we accomplish this to the best extent possible. We just recently had a aircraft going to Arizona, and the office wanted a flight into an airport that, just was kind of off the beaten path. And so you have to have those conversations on what is the art of the possible, and how can we make, meet your expectations. So we do have a lot of that back, as well as we talk with the dispatchers face to face. We talk with the maintenance technicians face to face. It is a much more integrated and networked organization.
All right, we are about out of time, but I did want to give Mariano a chance if you had a final question, Mariano.
Yeah, absolutely. So this question is for Sean with both civil and military aviation experience. One thing that I always tell my students who ask, like, is this the right time to get into aviation? Well, things come back up. I always say that after a downturn, there's always going to be a silver lining, essentially. So in your career, both civil and military, what would you say was the biggest challenge that you've had to face in the industry?
Downturns, definitely. I mean, I've been through 4 of them at least, and it is fairly cyclical. And it's, as I think David alluded to, is being flexible and trying to make hard decisions fast. Be the first one when you see the trend happening, just like flying an ILS, right? If your power's back and you see the trend rolling back, don't wait till you hear the stall warning. Make an input right away. So it's the same thing in life. Don't wait. Make the hard decisions fast and be flexible. And that's why your path will zigzag across, but ultimately it'll be very rich.
David?
I think just adding on to that, and something that Sean said earlier on, especially for Caitlin, the actual flying part, when you say you turn up and fly the plane, as you get more and more senior and get more experience, that'll become a smaller and smaller part of your day. There is so many more things that will enrich you around about operating with people, operating within a company environment. And as you start growing through that, you'll start building that knowledge of, hey, actually, I want to run that aircraft. I don't just want to fly it, which then takes you into a whole plethora of things right about that. And for you,
while we have you, any final tips for our young guests before we go?
Just go where life takes you and enjoy your career. It's a wonderful industry, regardless of what part you get into it, and you'll meet the most amazing people. And my final tip is, this industry is a village. So make friends, keep friends, you'll know them forever.
I totally agree with that. Sean?
I would, we're over time, so I will just say the same thing. It is a very small industry for a very large industry, and enjoy your path. It's going to be fun.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for being a part of this program. We really appreciate you being here, particularly you, Sean and David, in terms of making time in your busy schedules to share some insight and expertise about what you do and what the industry is all about. Couldn't agree with you guys more. It is a great industry. You meet great people and you form lifelong friendships for sure. So, and I'd like to thank our aspiring young aviation professional guests for also joining us, and you guys asked some great questions and had some great comments, so we appreciate everybody being here. So thank you everybody, and until next time, thanks for watching All Things Aviation. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.